go behind the meaning of the words.
Yes.
And so you just want to look at the words and use that as a data point, right?
Yes.
And in looking at the words, and you basically get different data points from all over then, right?
Yes.
That you pull together, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you're familiar with an string of emails that went back and forth between Mr. Alexander and Mr. and Mrs. Hughes?
Yes.
And you know in this email then that at one point Mr. Alexander, he's talking very highly of Miss Arias, isn't he?
Yes.
And how much he really how much he really is into her, right?
That he was interested in her, yes.
Right, and that he adores her.
I don't recall those exact words. If you want to show me, I'm happy to look at it.
I'm not speaking in exact words, but the context of the email itself, he's very fond of her, isn't he?
He felt fondly of her, yes.
And he actually, in his own words, talks about that everybody can agree that they don't get more honest than Jodi, right?
I don't know that specifically, but again, I'd be happy to look at the email you're referring to.
May I approach? Exhibit 589 at the top of the page.
The part that's underlined, yes.
Yes, okay. And so he's talking then about the fact that they don't come more honest than Jodi, right?
Yes, that's what he said.
And that's something that is in written word.
Yes.
Something that you don't want to go behind the meaning of, right? And you'll use that as a data point.
Yes.
And you'll also use as data points the fact that Mr. Alexander was very fond of Miss Arias.
Yes.
And that he speaks very highly of her.
He did in that email.
And that he worries that the things that Mr. and Mrs. Hughes said to her was upsetting for Jodi, right?
Yes.
And when we go down the road to May 26th of 2008, you're familiar with instant messaging, right? Instant messaging between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias?
There were several different ones. Which one are you referring to?
May 26th.
I don't know that exact date.
Okay, but you reviewed all these instant messages, right?
Yes.
Okay. And part of your review of the instant messages, you also reviewed the text messages.
Yes.
And in reviewing those things, you would agree that there were times when Mr. Alexander was quite upset with Jodi, right?
Yes.
And he showed his anger with Jodi in his text messages, didn't he?
Yes.
And he called her all kinds of names.
He called her names, yes.
And do you know what character assassination is?
Yes.
And isn't that when names become actually so severe that it cuts down the person's own character, their own being?
I think that would be one definition, yes.
Okay. And you'd agree that a lot of these names that he was calling her was actually character assassination, wasn't it?
They were harsh names, yes.
And you wouldn't consider that to be okay?
No, that's not okay.
And in fact, that was abusive, wasn't it?
Abuse implies that it's a pattern of behavior. I would say that that behavior was certainly inappropriate and not a healthy communication style.
Okay. But you don't consider it abusive?
I would say, again, the word abuse implies a pattern of behavior.
Well, we can talk about patterns in a second, but I'm talking about the word abuse. So you mean that unless it's repeated, this one particular instant wouldn't be considered abusive to you?
If we define abuse as a misuse of something,
no, Dr.
just
Marte,
a misuse, yes.
Hold on a second. What I'm asking you is this one particular instant, on May 26th, let's say, when Mr. Alexander, as you've agreed, was calling her names consistent with character assassination. You wouldn't agree that that's abusive?
I'm trying to explain to you what I mean.
Well, I'm asking, you're telling me that abuse is a pattern, so if it's just one instant, then is that not abuse?
I'd like to clarify. Can I speak?
It's a yes or no question.
I don't believe I can answer in yes or no.
All right. So then that's a no.
No, I just said I can't answer you in yes or no.
All right. So then let's talk about patterns. You want to talk about patterns, and when we talk about abuse, you want to look for more than one instance of it, right? For you to characterize it as abuse?
I, again, would like to clarify that.
Do you want to see a pattern when you're looking at abuse?
I'd like to clarify that.
Clarify the fact that whether or not you want to look at a pattern?
What I've been trying to clarify.
I'm moving on. So I'm just asking the question, do you want to see a pattern when you're looking for abuse?
It depends on how the word abuse is used. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. If it's implied that there's a pattern, no. If you're talking about the word abuse as being a misuse of something in one instance, then you can use the word abuse in a single incident, yes.
Okay. Did you clarify enough?
I did, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. So what I'm asking you is when you're looking at abuse in a relationship, do you look for patterns?
Yes,
Okay. And some of this abuse, you would agree that it can be psychological abuse, right?
yes,
And in fact, psychological abuse can be very damaging to a person, right?
it can be damaging.
And when we look at psychological abuse, you can look at the written word, right?
Yes,
And so on May 26th, when Mr. Alexander is calling Miss Arias a freaking whore, do you consider that particular word to be bad?
yes,
Do you consider it to be mean?
yes,
Do you consider it to be a word that that cuts her down?
yes,
Do you consider it to be mean when he talks about that he's never had to deal with a more solid form of evil? Is that mean?
those are not kind words.
So is that mean then?
Yes, I would put it in that category.
Okay. And when you talk about this conversation on May 26th, if you know that he has called her these types of names before this, let's talk about May 10th, or if he's called her names on April 8th, or April 7th, or March 30th, don't we start to see a pattern?
Are you talking about a hypothetical?
No, I'm asking, you've read through the text messages, right?
I have.
And you know that he calls her names, right?
Very rarely, yes.
You think very rarely he
Yes,
calls
I
her
would
names?
say that.
Okay. And so, how do you define rare?
I would say that it happened periodically, the pattern that I saw, that it was in response to him feeling like she was being intrusive or had crossed a boundary, and he was putting up very firm boundaries.
That's not what I'm asking you. I'm talking about rare. So rare is once or twice or more?
Are you asking me in this situation how many times it happened, or just
No,
the definition
I'm asking
of rare?
you said he rarely was abusive to her.
Yes.
So, and actually you said he rarely called her names, but are you going to use the word abusive with that or just calling names?
Calling names.
Okay. And so you consider all the numerous text messages that you've read and the numerous instant messages that you've read between the two of them, you would consider anytime he ever called her names, that was just happened rarely, right?
I would say that it happened infrequently. I think that's a better word.
Frequently?
Infrequently.
Oh, infrequently. Better than rarely.
That's probably a word that I would use, yes.
And infrequently is what then?
It's not often. It's a handful of times.
Okay. And so a handful of times then becomes what, less relevant to you?
No, that's not less relevant.
So it's more relevant?
No, it's relevant.
It's relevant, okay.
Yes.
And when you're talking about then this, do you think it's acceptable behavior for him to act like this?
I think anytime people speak to each other like that, that's not acceptable behavior.
Okay, so you'd agree that he was acting in an unacceptable way, right?
He had an unhealthy communication pattern.
Oh, he had an unhealthy,
In those moments.
So he spoke enough times to her in this manner that you would say that it was an unhealthy communication pattern, right?
In those moments.
You just called it a pattern, right?
Yes, in those moments.
No, you just called it a pattern. You're talking about the unhealthy communication he had with her as a pattern, right?
In those exchanges. There were lengthy exchanges.
So
That's
now-
what I was referring to. The
so
pattern
now-
within the exchanges.
So now you want to call it a pattern when you're just talking about one conversation.
Within the exchanges. They were long exchanges.
Right, so these long exchanges, just one exchange is considered a pattern to you?
In the way that they were written between the two of them, they were long exchanges between the two of them. So within that exchange, yes, I would say that there was a pattern in that response.
Okay, so within that one response, you're going to say there's a pattern of how he responds.
Because he used multiple different words, like you just highlighted.
So there is a pattern in his response in these responses, right?
In those exchanges, yes.
Okay, and in this pattern of his responses, you see a pattern of him of calling her bad names, right?
Yes, the pattern I see is that he's responding.
The pattern that you see in these exchanges is one of him calling her bad names, right?
Yes,
Okay, and assaulting her character, right?
yes,
And calling her names like whore.
Yes.
And slut. Yes?
I don't remember that specifically, but if you have it in front of you, I'd be happy to look at it.
You don't remember him calling her a slut?
That name in particular, no.
Okay.
It's possible.
Well,
I could look at it.
Okay, well, you remember that he talks about having her living a life identical to Satan. Do you remember that?
I do recall something similar to that.
And telling her that she's worthless. Do you remember that?
Something similar to that.
You remember him calling her a three-hole wonder?
I do remember that.
And so in this pattern of during this conversation, he is being abusive, isn't he?
Yes, he was using words that were very unkind and maladaptive.
Okay. And so this is the instant messaging that happens on May 26th. There's also a text message from May 26th, isn't there? Do you remember that?
I remember there were numerous text messages. I'd be happy to look at it.
All right. Well, you understand that the instant messaging on May 26th is preceded by text messages, or do you not remember that?
I know that there was IMs and also text messages.
Okay. And so in text messages, he also called her names, didn't he?
I don't know if it's that specific date. Again, I'd like to see the documents that you're referring to.
Well, let's not talk about a specific date.
Okay.
Just in text messages that you reviewed, you know that there were messages, these conversations between the two of them that you would characterize as a pattern, right?
I would say that they were infrequent comments that were made.
No, you called it a pattern earlier. Are you taking that back?
I'm not taking anything back. You're changing my words.
No. Did you not just say pattern just a few minutes ago?
I said pattern in those specific exchanges, that there was a pattern within. You're talking about now a pattern across. That's a very different presentation.
No, I'm not talking about that. So let me make sure that you understand
Please
me, okay?
clarify.
So I'm talking about in a specific text message conversation. You read through all their text messages, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. And when you read through the text messages, did you see within, let's talk about just one conversation when he's upset with her?
Yes.
Just any particular one.
Okay.
Within that conversation, you see a pattern, don't you, of him calling her bad names again?
Within the text messages, yes.
Okay. So we have one that we know of from May 26th, right?
That's the date you gave me, yes.
Okay. And then you've seen another conversation when he is extremely calling her bad names, right?
Yes.
And you consider that to be another pattern within that conversation.
Are you now highlighting a third instance, or are you still talking about that second one?
Second.
Yes.
Okay. And you had other communications, you reviewed other communications between them where there was a third time when he is calling her bad names, right?
I'd like to see that.
Do you not remember that?
I remember that there, again, were infrequent situations.
Well, I know you keep wanting to say infrequent, but you're not giving me any information as to that infrequency. What we're talking about here is specific conversations where you're telling me within this conversation there is a pattern of him calling her bad names and character assassination, right?
Objection, lack of foundation, date and time, conversation. Overruled.
What I'm saying to you is that in order to be accurate in how I respond, I'd like to see what you're referring to so that I'm not misleading in any kind of way.
Because you wouldn't want to be misleading, right?
Correct.
And you wouldn't want to add anything into your answers just to mislead people, right?
Right, I don't want to mislead anybody.
Okay, so we can agree then that you would want to just answer the questions as they're posed so that you don't give any misleading information.
Right.
Okay. You were asked questions about when Mr. Alexander made comments about being afraid of Miss Arias, right?
Yes.
And that you wouldn't want to go behind those words, right?
Right.
You wouldn't want to do any further investigation as to why he might say something like that, right?
I can't do that. He's not alive.
Right, but you wouldn't want to use any of your other data points to investigate why he might say that?
I would use this as an objective data point that I would then use in addition to everything else, putting it together, but I wouldn't alter the words. It's not possible to alter the words.
No, you wouldn't want to alter the words, but wouldn't you want to understand and put those words in context?
And would I look at it in context? Yes, I would look at it in context.
And you would want to look at then behaviors and investigate maybe whether or not there's any true meaning behind these words, right?
I couldn't do that because he's not alive.
So when somebody's not alive, you can't get any information from them. Is that what you mean?
From them directly, that's correct because they're not alive.
So you can't make any type of, do any type of an evaluation as to anything that he says in written word because you can't look at other data points with regard to Mr. Alexander.
No, what I was referring to is what we started talking about was going behind the word and getting more information about those words in particular. That's what I was speaking about.
Right. And so to try and put meaning to that word, what I'm saying is that you don't want to look at any other data points that relate to what he's saying in these words, right?
No, I would absolutely look at other data points, but I wouldn't change the actual wording. I wouldn't be able to go behind it, but I'd be able to have other data points that I would then integrate.
Right. So,
May we approach very quickly?
yes.
This time, please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition, you are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Counsel, anything before the noon recess?
No, thank you.
We are at recess.